I wanted to do a quick video on how to do a compression check on a late model Evo. When I say late model, I mean 1990 and later. The video is going to feature using a booster battery, and the reason that's really useful is, let's say you want to get one of these old motorcycles and the bike that you want to buy does not run. But it's always a good idea to know what the compression is before you shell out whatever cash you're going to shell out. A couple of things do need to be taken off the bike, and the first thing is the air cleaner. When you do the compression check, you have to open the butterfly. So if you look inside, you can see I'm going to open the butterfly valve like this. Of course, the slide is going to drop, but let's just take one thing at a time. To keep the butterfly valve open, I'm going to tape the throttle grip in position. So just going to take a couple of turns of tape around the grip and then pull the brake lever in and go around the brake lever. So now my butterfly valve is open. The slide, of course, is still down, but we'll get to that in a minute. So the next thing you want to do is drain the gas. So you want to shut off the fuel valve and drain the gas out of the carburetor. The drain screw is right there. And the carburetor has a little drain hose. You can just put it in a suitable container and collect all the gasoline. Another thing that you want to do is disable your ignition system, and that can be done by disconnecting the primary wires here. Of course, you can take the spark plug and put it in the lead like that and ground it somewhere. A better way to do it is to jump the lead like this. So you can have a little jumper like so. And you can essentially just ground the lead like this. If you don't have one of these, just something like that will do the trick. Just go right into the lead and then ground it somewhere. So, and you want to do it for both spark plugs, but in this particular case I'm not going to worry about any of that, and that is because this motorcycle has a push button starter cover which I installed, and these are really useful for a number of reasons. Sometimes things go wrong with the starting system. There's a relay and there's a push button on the handlebar. This is going to be the easiest way to start the bike, and if everything else fails, like your relay goes out, the direct start button is going to get the bike going. Another reason, as you'll see in a second, these things are really useful is that you can do a compression check without actually having to turn the ignition on. So I don't have to worry about disabling my ignition. The starter is always hot, so when I manually press this button, the engine is going to turn, and I can do my compression check without worrying about disabling the ignition system. The next thing we need to do is connect a booster battery to the motorcycle. So this is a big car battery. The way we're going to do that is we're going to connect the negative terminal to where the negative cable is grounded to the frame. And then we're going to connect the positive cable to the positive. Now, the problem is we have no access to our battery. So what I've done here is I've made this special tool. All this is just a copper tube. It's, I believe, 5/8 outside diameter, and this heat shrink tubing, I believe, was 3/4. So all you do is you take this tube, you smash the end, and I used a round file, which was a 3/8 file, to make kind of a round slot, and then use a straight file to open up the edges a little bit. And then the insulation needs to go around, and only this edge is exposed. And the reason I made this tool is because now I can reach to the starter. This terminal is hot, and then I can just use this tool right there on the terminal without arcing against the body of the starter. So it's very, very important to have this insulation in place. We need to connect our gauge to the engine. We need to remove both of the plugs. And before I've already cleaned these areas out, but you don't want any debris falling down your spark plug hole because it can damage the cylinder walls. So that's all been blown out with compressed air. Now I'm going to connect the tester. This is a 14mm plug. You can see these O-rings. There's really no need to crank on these too hard because it can deform the O-rings. What I do instead is I use a little bit of sealing grease, Smolykote 111, just a little bit around the O-ring. We can thread our tester in. And I'm just going to test one cylinder to demonstrate a couple of things. So when I screw it in, I'm just going to hold the opposite end and just turn it with relatively little force. I really don't want to torque on it too hard and deform my O-ring. So now we're good to go. The next thing we need to do is rotate the engine a little bit. The engine is cold, but that's fine. What I want to do is I want to turn the engine over just to get some oil on the cylinder wall. One of the advantages of the booster battery is going to keep the RPM constant. I mean, I can do any number of tests here, and because I have a lot of capacity, I'm not going to kill either battery, and I can maintain the RPM consistent so that my results are going to be consistent. Making sure that the transmission is in neutral. I'm just going to depress this button and let it run for a few revolutions. So again, I did not have to disable my ignition because I'm just using, and I didn't turn it on because I'm using the push button cover. So now I have some oil in the cylinder walls. The next thing I want to do is I'm going to use this little rod to lift the slide. Let me hook up the gauge. And I'm going to rotate the engine about 10 times. And every time you do a test, you want to rotate the engine the same number of times. And you can see we're getting 150 psi. So now we're going to burp the gauge. And then another thing that people talk about when they do these compression tests is opening or closing the choke. So let's go around on the other side. One thing to keep in mind is that if you have a choke, then you don't want to close your choke because it's going to restrict the amount of air that's going to be able to get through the carburetor. Now, one thing we need to think about for as far as these late model Evos are concerned, that this is not really a choke. Instead, this is an enricher. So instead of choking off an air passage as a choke would do, what an enricher does, it actually opens a fuel passage. If this were a choke, you would not want to pull the choke because it would close an air passage. But you could open the enricher because all you're doing is you're opening an extra passage that goes from the float bowl, which is now devoid of fuel, and is going to be sucking air into the combustion chamber. But now, it's such a small volume that it's not going to make any difference. Let's run the test with the enricher pulled out, which means we're opening the enrichment passage, and see what the result is. And there's really not going to be a change. So again, I'm lifting the slide just to compare apples to apples. Rotate the engine 10 times. So as you can see, we're still getting 150 psi. So it's really not that big of a deal. Whether or not you open the enricher or you keep it closed doesn't make any difference. Really not a big deal whether or not you open the slide. I mean, it might give you a couple more psi. So yeah, so this is pretty much how you do a compression test. Just remember, if you don't have a direct start button or a push button cover like this, you have to disable your ignition, drain the fuel out of the carburetor, take the air cleaner off, number one, because you want as much air getting through into the engine as possible, and also if you do want to lift the slide, that's the only way you're going to be able to do that. As far as the readings are concerned with these Evos, the big twins, If it's stock 150 psi, there shouldn't be more than about 10% difference between the front and the rear cylinder. If you're doing the test hot, pressure in the cylinder will probably go up a little bit. It'll be a little bit higher than 150. But you have to be mindful when you're doing it. Things are going to be hot, the pipe's going to be hot, so when you're using this thing, don't burn your hands, don't melt the insulation. If you do warm the motorcycle up, you can give it a little bit of time to cool down. As long as it's warm, you should be fine.